Have you ever watched a brilliant colleague, someone you really respected for their sharp, independent mind, just suddenly start speaking in corporate jargon? Their critical thinking just gets replaced by this unwavering, almost religious company loyalty? Well, what you were witnessing wasn't just team spirit, no. It was the result of a deliberate, powerful, and nearly invisible system of social engineering. Today, we're not just talking about culture or community. We are going to dissect the raw mechanics of what we're calling group identity control, the hidden architecture of the tribal trap that operates right in plain sight, everywhere from boardrooms to political movements, shaping our behavior without ever showing its hand.
This quote, it just perfectly captures the insidious nature of this system. See, this isn't about physical restraint. It's not about chains and bars. It is about psychological capture. The system creates what we'll call the warmth of the cage. It works not by directly telling you you can't leave, but by meticulously crafting the world outside to seem desolate and terrifying. Leaving doesn't just mean losing a job or a few friends. No, it's engineered to feel like a form of social death. It's a step into a cold, indifferent void where you are utterly alone and anonymous. And that comfort of belonging, that warmth, becomes a powerful, powerful incentive to stay put, even when you know, deep down, that the cage is still a cage.
So that brings us right to the heart of the paradox. We're going to unpack what the source material calls the neurological gravity of belonging. And I want you to think of it like a real physical force. Our brains are hardwired with this deep, primal need to be part of a tribe. For millennia, our very survival depended on it, right? Being exiled meant certain death. But at the exact same time, we have this conscious drive for personal agency, for autonomy, for the right to think for ourselves. And that creates this fundamental tension, a constant pull between the safety of the group and the freedom of the individual. This is the battleground where group identity control operates.
Now here's what's really fascinating. This reframes a concept we all think we understand: culture. We're taught to see culture as shared passion, this positive, organic thing. But a deeper analysis shows it's often something else entirely: a boundary audit. Group identity control is this invisible system where a leader, let's call them an identity architect, takes your most human vulnerability, that need to be loved and accepted, and literally weaponizes it against your ability to think and act for yourself. They aren't building a community, they are executing a capture. They define the rules of who's in and who's out, and every single interaction, every meeting, every casual conversation becomes a subtle test of your allegiance.
This whole system is so effective because it bypasses our rational minds and it targets a primal, almost reptilian fear. To our primitive brain, being cast out of the group, unbelonging, it's not just an emotional slight. It is processed as being equivalent to death. It's a deep existential survival threat. And identity architects exploit this by creating a self-contained world, an insulated bubble. They give you secret languages, inside jokes, and, most importantly, common enemies. And look, these aren't just cultural quirks. They are meticulously designed tests of loyalty. They're engineered to make you overfunction, to erase your own personal boundaries, to do things you wouldn't normally do, all to avoid the primal terror of being left outside in the cold.
Okay, so let's make this real. Let's see how this abstract architecture actually shows up in the real world. We're going to ground this whole concept in a pattern that many of us have seen, maybe even in the mirror: the high-performing conformist. And this isn't about someone weak or unintelligent, not at all. This is about the brilliant, capable individual who walks into a new environment and undergoes a shocking transformation. This is where we get to observe the sudden, almost inexplicable erosion of individual agency.
We've all witnessed this, right? And it's unsettling. A brilliant, independent expert, a strategist, an engineer, a scientist, joins some new high-status group. They're sharp, they're objective, they rely on professional logic, their network is diverse. But then, within months, a change happens. It's subtle at first. Their language shifts to include all the latest office jargon. Their once subjective analysis gets replaced by this fierce, almost reflexive in-group bias. And the competitors they once respected, they're now demonized, spoken of with contempt. This is that sudden erosion of agency. It's a form of cognitive capture, where their deep-seated need to be accepted, to be one of us, becomes the primary driver, just overriding years of expertise and independent thought.
This process leads to something the source calls agency atrophy. And this is the central, tragic paradox of the tribal trap. The more you desperately try to prove your loyalty, the more disposable you become to the leader. Your desperate need to belong creates a fear-based leash that they can pull at any time. You are no longer seen as a sovereign source of value and insight, you just become a manageable, predictable node in their network. Your unique perspective, the very thing that made you valuable in the first place, has been completely sanded down.
You've willingly handed over the remote control to your own brain, all because someone made you feel special just for being in the room. So how does this capture actually happen? It's so important to understand that this isn't random or accidental. It is a deliberate system of social engineering with a predictable architecture. So in this next section, we're going to deconstruct the step-by-step process of how an individual's identity is systematically seized. This is where we pull back the curtain and really look at the gears and levers of the machine.
So, the system operates is a 4-stage capture loop that methodically moves you from initial categorization to complete cognitive capture. It starts with what's called the Shibboleth Strike, which creates the initial us. It then moves to outgroup devaluation to create a them. Next, it trains you through self-regulation, turning the policing inward. And finally, it establishes a tribal monopoly over your very perception of reality. Let's break each of these insidious stages down.
Okay, first step, the Shibboleth Strike. A shibboleth is an ancient term for a custom or a piece of language that distinguishes one group from another. Think of it as a secret handshake. The leader identifies these arbitrary rituals. It could be a specific way of celebrating wins, a unique piece of jargon that nobody outside the company understands, even an inside joke about a failed project. And they don't just introduce these things, they saturate the environment with them. This targets a specific part of your brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You can think of it as your brain's social connection hub. When you participate, your brain releases chemicals that create a similarity reward, that warm, comforting feeling of safety. The leader is essentially building a neurological map of your desire to belong, just waiting for that feeling of us to override your natural skepticism.
Right. So once that initial gate of us is opened, the system requires a them to solidify the boundary. This is the outgroup devaluation phase. A skilled identity architect knows it is not enough to praise the in-group. You have to actively demonize everyone else. You'll hear things like, "Oh, they don't have our standards. They just don't get it." Or, "That old way of doing things is for losers." This is a completely strategic move. It triggers a state of what psychologists call neural superiority. The outside world is framed not just as different, but as a threat to the group's success, and therefore a threat to your personal self-esteem and status. Suddenly, critiquing your own group feels like an act of self-harm, because your identity is now completely fused with the group's.
And this leads directly to the most powerful, and frankly the most insidious phase, self-regulation training. The leader now uses what's called a cohesion anchor. They provide reward warmth, that feeling of approval, praise, inclusion. But here's the key. It is only given when you correctly police your own behavior or the behavior of others to align with the group's norms. You see a teammate deviating from the right way of thinking? You correct them. You have a dissenting thought during a meeting? You silence it before it even reaches your lips. Your brain begins to associate total alignment with safety and reward and dissent with anxiety and exclusion. You start to self-submit, willingly erasing your own agency just to turn off that constant, low-level fear of not fitting in.
So here's the thing. This architecture works. It's not just theory. It works with frightening efficiency. And it works even on highly intelligent, data-driven, skeptical people. Which brings us to the big question, why? Why does the human brain so readily choose group consensus over objective, verifiable truth? Well, the answer isn't about intelligence or weakness. The answer lies deep in our evolutionary wiring.
So this really is the central question we have to tackle, right? Why does this capture loop work so well? Especially in environments where people pride themselves on logic and evidence, in tech and finance and academia. Why do smart people fall into this trap, surrendering their agency, when on paper they should know better? It's because the system isn't targeting their intellect. It's not an argument to be won with logic. It's a system that bypasses reason entirely and targets their biology.
And here it is. This is the fundamental, brutal trade-off. This is rooted in a field of psychology known as social identity theory, pioneered by researchers like Henri Tajfel. Decades of research show that when we're faced with a choice between a clear material truth and a conflicting group consensus, our brain will often, and I mean often, default to choosing the consensus. Why? Because the metabolic and social cost of enduring exile, of being cast out, is processed by our ancient brain circuitry as a more immediate and dangerous threat than the abstract cost of accepting a lie. A skilled manipulator understands this instinctively, and they leverage this pre-built blindness against you. To resolve this painful internal conflict between what we know is true and what the group says is true, our brains employ this clever mental shortcut, what the source calls the heuristic of belonging. We start processing agreement not as a sign of correctness, but as a sign of good character. So disagreement then feels like a moral failing, like an act of betrayal. We use the idea of unity to justify our own submission. We tell ourselves things like, we're just a very close-knit team, or we're all aligned on the mission, just to avoid the painful cognitive dissonance of admitting the truth that we are being chemically managed by a deep-seated fear of exclusion.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the why. Let's move to the how. How do we actually diagnose this in the wild? Now that we understand the architecture of the trap and the biology it exploits, how do we spot it in our own lives, in our own organizations? This section is all about equipping you with the diagnostic tools to recognize these patterns, to move from just passively feeling the warmth of the cage to actively auditing its boundaries.
The primary indicator, the flashing red warning light on the dashboard, is what's termed the consensus logic disconnection. This is that moment you notice that the group's official opinion and the actual material reality have fundamentally diverged. For instance, everyone in the meeting agrees the project is a huge success, but the data shows it's a catastrophic failure. When the narrative inside the group no longer aligns with the data, the results, or the facts outside of it, you're seeing the system of capture at work. That gap between what is said and what is true, that is the precise measure of the leader's control.
And this disconnection from reality, it reveals a really painful, counterintuitive truth, the belonger's paradox. And the paradox is this: the individual who appears to be the most loyal, the most dedicated, the most all-in member of the group is very often the one who is most deeply captured and most blind to their own exploitation. Their extreme loyalty isn't a sign of conviction or strength, it's a symptom. It's the outward manifestation of their deep-seated, unconscious fear of seeing the truth of their situation.
And this quote it brilliantly illustrates the immense psychological cost. This overvaluation of loyalty makes their position incredibly fragile. They have invested so much of their personal and professional identity in the group that to even question the group would trigger a full-blown identity crisis. This loyalty forces them into an impossible choice: stay and continue to be a compliant, tribal node for someone else's narrative, suppressing your own thoughts and feelings, or leave and face the cold, terrifying reality of being sovereignly, completely alone.
This brings us to our final, and frankly, most important section, the sovereign mindset. After all this diagnostic analysis, after deconstructing the trap, what is the strategic implication? How do you reclaim your agency once you realize it's been compromised? Well, the answer isn't a simple tactic or some clever trick. It's a fundamental, radical reframing of where real power and value truly come from.
So here's the crucial point. The key to breaking free is this: true power is not found in being the most loyal person in the room. It is found in being the person who does not need the group's approval to validate their own perception of reality. Just understanding the mechanics of identity control, everything we've discussed today, that's the first step toward dismantling its power over you. Awareness collapses the system because it exposes the exchange for what it is, a transaction where you trade your agency for a feeling of safety. And it forces you to confront the reality that belonging is not the same as growth. In fact, it's often the enemy of it.
And that leaves us with this final provocative thought, a diagnostic weapon, if you will. The antidote to the tribal trap isn't to find a better, more enlightened tribe. No, it is a fundamental shift in your internal operating system. It is a conscious decision to stop optimizing for belonging and to start optimizing for truth. Reclaim your intellectual sovereignty, because in any group, in any organization, the person who can maintain that boundary, the person who needs to be right more than they need to be liked, that is the person who owns their own future.